start off by like, what's your ideal day in Cape Cod? What are your favorite places in Cape Cod to go to?
My favorite day on the Cape?
Yeah.
That would ask me. I love that question because I'm about to have one when I get there next week, I hope. Let me think. I wake up at my lovely house
Mhm.
in the morning and I walk down Long Nook Road, which is a very beautiful road, to the ocean and take a walk. And then I'd probably go and see my parents, who will be in the backwoods of Wellfleet and Truro on the pond that in the backwoods on the freshwater ponds, which is what I wrote about or where I set the novel. And then have dinner with my sisters in Provincetown, something like that. Nice day like that. Maybe go to the beach, but not swim too far out so that we don't get eaten by sharks,
Given.
that kind of
Given. That sounds so lovely.
yeah, the hammock is always nice. The garden is always nice. So,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Read
I'm
by
very
the
looking forward.
water.
It's nice. Or, by the way, getting some work done, which is also doesn't seem to happen practically these days. I'm so busy. So, yeah.
Yeah. I read your poetry book. Phenomenal. It was
Thank
really,
you.
really, really great. I have a couple like printed out. I have many questions to ask you about your poetry. Um, but first off, so you started with Paper Palace. It was your debut novel, fiction, and then you've gone into poetry. What's
No, but
no?
that is how it appears because
Yes.
I published a novel first.
Oh,
And then I published
okay.
poetry, which represents stuff that's been pulled from at least 15 years of work. I was writing poetry before the novel. In fact, I've always written poetry but and had some published, of course, but it's not that easy to get a poetry book out into the world, as most poets know. And a lot of the poetry kind of ended up in the novel itself. It kind of taught me, I'd started the novel somewhere in the midst of all of this many years before and just wasn't able to write it in a fluid way. And so I just put it aside and just worked on my poetry. And at a certain point, I took it back out and I kind of knew how to write in a different way because I'd progressed, into different forms with poetry. So yeah, so actually, funnily enough, um, the very first thing I ever quote unquote published was a poem that I wrote when I was 5 that I found that my stepfather transcribed, and I found it last Christmas in he's a painter, and I found it in one of his old, painting notebooks, whatever, drawing books on Cape Cod. And it was called, and I love this, The Path is Long, which makes me really laugh since it was a 5-year-old. Uh, of course, I was actually talking about the path to the beach from
Okay.
my house, which was very irritatingly long. The title doesn't sound like that.
I was like, that's very deep for 5 years old.
I know. Well, I will also say that my first book I ever published at age 8,
Yeah.
which I wrote for my grandfather, who was also a poet of nature poems. The title poem in that little tiny book that I'd put together was called Life. So, yes.
Wow.
Apparently, I had yeah. So kind of fun.
Very deep since your childhood. That's very interesting.
I was not that deep. I was clearly very precocious.
But publishing and writing books and for your grandfather, that's very lovely. So with your poems, you said it took 15 years. Like, how do your like poems come to you? I know with a lot of authors, like they're like, oh, this idea just comes to me, and I just like, do you have specific moments where you remember these ideas for poems coming to you? Or they're just like,
Not at all,
no?
actually. It's very writing poetry, at least for me, everybody has their own thing. For me, and this is what sort of changed the way I was writing the novel. In fact, it's about the blank page. You're writing from it's almost like you're accessing your unconscious brain, particularly because, you have no idea what you're going to write about and stuff comes out. And what I find is that I have no idea where I'm going to begin.
Mhm.
And it eventually, you know, opens up into something that I wasn't expecting. And of course, in that sense, sometimes, one goes back to the very beginning of where you started that morning, as it were, because you've found the poem once you've kind of written into it.
Mhm.
But it's always this really fun kind of exploration. I find it kind of sometimes it's crap and sometimes it's great. You know, you never know what you're going to get. But
Yeah.
for me, I just, whatever word comes into my head first is where I start.
Yeah. That reminds me of a line that you wrote in one of the poems. I think it's the first poem. You're like, I'll write something good or something bad.
Oh, that's very funny. You're right. Yeah. Well, I think that that probably speaks for most
Yeah.
writers, you know, unless you're Tolstoy or something. But yeah.
Well, yeah, given. So your grandfather is a Malcolm Cowley. Is that I'm pronouncing it correctly?
Yes.
Yes,
Correct.
he is like a renowned poet. He's famous and a writer. Did he inspire you in any way? Like you clearly wrote that book of poetry for him. Like,
Yes, he certainly did. He was a poet. He was also an editor and a literary critic, and also kind of and wrote many, published many, many books about the writers of his generation and 20th century, many of whom were his close friends, like Hemingway and Fitzgerald and so on. He's long gone from this world, my grandfather. But he also wrote, or rather edited, what the Walt Whitman's, a portable Whitman, they
mhm,
called it. And so that was very much, Whitman was one of the first poets that, you know, I was exposed to, which is probably explains a lot about how I write now, because, you know, that's, first of all, it's very Massachusetts, right?
very.
But also very almost, I'm going to say ecstatic, meaning sort of almost surreal in places. And he just lets himself go to nature, but also into the soul. And so that was very much, yeah, I would say definitely. And then as well, my parents, my mother, my stepfather is a painter, but he grew up as a child having to memorize so much. I mean, he just memorizes everything. And we always, every year at his birthday, which is always on Cape Cod because it's in August, the whole family at his birthday lunch, we all recite the Skylark, Shelley, and each of us takes a verse and we go around the table, and that's just this strange tradition. So I guess, you know, it was all around me.
Yeah, that's amazing. Poetry's always been a part of your life. So did your family ever give you like any advice on poetry, like your grandfather, your parents? Like, did you get any advice that's carried with you or?
Um, Not there was a poet who was one of my parents' best friends on the Cape, who lived in Wellfleet, and he was called Arturo Vivante. And I remember I must have shown him some poetry when I was very little, because every time he would see me, he would ask me what he was, you know, what I was writing, and would I show him things, and you go, oh, there's the poet. And I think in a funny way, you know, somebody tells you something, and it becomes a kind of intrinsic part of one's being, you know, one's self-understanding. Then, of course, I went off and had a completely other life and other career and so on and so forth, and then eventually made my way back to really focusing on writing. But it took a long, long time before that happened. So.
Yeah. Did you always know that you wanted to be a writer? Like, was this something that ended up happening to you, or has this always been like your lifelong goal? I mean, you've had a phenomenal career. It's a very crazy resume that you've got going on.
Right. Well, I mean, yes, I always thought I was going to be a writer. That didn't occur to me really otherwise, but I was an editor
Mhm.
for quite some time, and then a ghostwriter. I lacked the kind of confidence to go up against. There are so many writers actually in my family or married into the family and so on, and I was too stuck in my own self-conscious head. You know,
Yeah.
it's like being a bad actor or something. You know, I thought I was gonna, I fell in love and I quit my job at Cosmopolitan magazine as the associate fiction and books editor at age like 24, and went to Italy because I fell madly in love and I was going to write the great novel. And of course, please, I mean, I was just not, I had no life experience, you know. So it took me a very long time actually to get back to a place where actually I was able to not only access, but was able to have the time and had, you know, left the television world long. That's been, so, that was, you know, 15 years. That was so many years ago that, you know, it's ancient history to me, but I know it keeps coming up with people.
It's very cool. I mean, The Sopranos, all of that. So that kind of leads me to my next question. You're writing the screenplay for The Paper Palace, correct?
Hmm.
for HBO. Can you?
Well, not anymore.
No, not
So
anymore.
no, HBO, I don't know what exactly is going to happen with it.
Okay.
Uh, it's not going to be at HBO,
Okay.
because they had a lot of sort of of internal changes
Oh,
and kind of put things to the side. Um, so I'm very much in the process of deciding which way to go, whether there are options, but I've been focused on this and
mhm.
focused on, so the script exists and it's just a question of where to go with it and it will get made. I just don't know whether I won't think of it now as a film, maybe as opposed to a mini series, and so there's decisions to be made.
Okay, great. Well, that scrapping that question that I had. So you spoke to Penguin Random House at one point about your former novel about Peter and Jonas, and you said that there are like places that ground us and shape us, and it made me wonder, like, what are your places that ground you and have shaped you?
Right. Well, definitely Cape Cod, of course. And the camp that we grew up in, which in fact is as described a rather shabby, funny, little old falling apart cabins, in fact, made of a kind of pressed paper or so originally. That is where I, lived and was barefoot and all, running around dirt roads in the backwoods of the Cape. I don't know how well you know that end of Cape Cod, but it's very, very different once you
Yeah.
get to the outer Cape. It's much more wild. And it was very much sort of the 70s, and we were very free. And our parents were, typically naked on the beach. It was all those kinds of things where, we're trying to avoid them. Uh, but I think, it's interesting because in the novel, I would, it's not exact by any means, but the stage set
Mhm.
is very much based on my place. The story is not. The story is made up, but everybody always loves to think, oh, we recognize the place, therefore this must be true, which is,
Mhm.
what I wish that, I had two men like that vying over me, what could be better, but no, that's not actually how it goes.
We all dream of the love triangle.
I know. Well, particularly at my age, but yeah, or I think at any age, frankly, the two men who want you more than anything in the world, what could be better than that?
I
But
know. I mean, I grew up on Twilight, so I've always been like
yes, that's exactly right. It's
the
like
Jacob Edward,
the men.
the
Exactly.
werewolf, the vampire.
Well, I mean, I was like, there's Team Jonas and there has to be Team Peter.
Yeah.
And part of when I was writing it, what I had to be very careful about was that they were equal weight.
Hmm.
There was that if it was more one than the other, that you'd start out going, ugh, of course she has to be with Peter. But
Yeah.
then you'd understand some piece of Jonas and you go, oh my gosh, of course. And then you'd go back. And if you can't, so it's sort of two equal train engines on a collision course. But if
Yeah.
one of them weighs much more, it's not a fair fight, right? So that was
Hmm.
very much part of my, you know, the very much the structure of
Yeah.
character with them. Yeah.
And I think it makes a much more compelling storytelling for the reader because then you're like, well, I don't know. She
Yeah.
doesn't know, and I don't know, and no one knows.
Right. No one knows.
No one
Exactly.
knows.
Exactly.
Um, so going to your poetry, this book of poetry. So there was a couple things, a couple notes that I took as I was reading it. There's three things that always come up, at least that I was noticing: birds, water, and motherhood.
Yeah. Yes. Well, there are
And
many mothers in there,
yes.
definitely. There's different kinds of mothers.
Yeah.
There are mothers based on mothers.
Mhm.
Whether there's mothers based on myself as a mother. There are other mothers as well that
Yeah.
are completely sort of, I hope, more universal. And, you know, one of the things I should say actually before this is that I didn't write it in any kind of, it's divided into sort of
Yeah.
six sections that start with childhood and go through to kind of, I guess, I hope still in middle age, but I don't know if I can claim that. But, uh, but it was not written that way at all. I mean, the poetry just was written in whatever order it was written and whatever it was about over many years. It was just that when I finally chose over a long period of time what I wanted to include, and I looked at it all, I realized that actually it could be grouped.
Yeah.
In fact, it sort of, if I put it into a chronology that hadn't existed. But what's really emerged for me is that the mother and be- because it's chronological,
Mhm.
it's not, but because they were, they're about different stages of life, the mother-daughter relationship really develops, which is interesting to me. It wasn't something you think about, but then when you look at your own writing and how things come out from a point of view of a child or a point of view of an angry teenager, or it's a, so that was kind of a discovery, in fact, for me. And more humor as it moved forward. Speaking of humor, one of the things you're saying birds, and I again, not something I was aware of at
Yeah.
all, but I've been reading a lot of poetry, of course, and there's so many poets who talk about birds, and the birds are always sort of, I'm not going to say aspirational, but they're, if only I could be a nightingale and have that
Mhm.
beautiful voice, or if I could live and soar into the sky, or if I could do this, or, Wild Geese by Mary Oliver, that kind of idea. And most of my birds, I realized, are sort of a bit of a mess. You know,
What do
it's
you mean?
it's like the finch that doesn't know, what to do, or the rooster that thinks it's, dawn at 3 a.m., or you know, the helpless birds in swarming in a storm, and so on. There's some that have purpose, like, the hummingbirds
Mhm.
being able to fly backward. But so that would be like probably the one bird, but I talk about the horrible shrieking gulls and
Yes.
they're not, and the mean, pelicans I was like, this is weird. Where
But
did
there's a lot of birds.
There's a lot of birds, but they're also like, they're not, there's
Yeah.
in certain places they are, I think there's one poem about the, fear of falling and how wonderful it would be to be a bird. And that, would be, if anything, my take on one of the more classic poems. But in general, there were a lot of faulty birds,
Which I like because I feel like that's more accurate to a lot of birds. They're all a little
you
cuckoo,
know.
if we're being honest.
Yeah.
You also talk about yeah, the chickens a lot. I mean, I noticed that you kind of started the book with chickens, and you also towards the end there's another poem about chickens.
Okay, you are brilliant. I mean, I hadn't even thought about that. It's totally true. And in fact, originally, I wanted the whole book to end on the little chicken thing as a sort of uh, an extra bit,
Mhm.
after it was finished, because it felt so hopeful to me, just sort of the image of sunrise after such a journey, in which case it would literally have been bookended by chickens. So you've just pointed something out really that I had not noticed. I'm going to have to steal that from you, in fact, and pretend it was
Please
purposeful.
go right ahead. I was like, because chickens are, I'm always so fascinated by chickens because they're kind of like a weird bird. They're very not up there, but they're very also smart. I mean, they confuse me. They're kind of the most,
Apparently, they can be pets. I have friends who say they're very cozy and you
yeah.
carry them around on their arms or whatever. And what I in that last sort of funny poem about the chickens, it is true that they do everything. The miracle of chickens, as I talk about, is that they pee, they go
Mhm.
they go to the bathroom in every possible way, give birth, create eggs, and everything is out. They have one teeny hole, and
Yeah,
everything they do everything that way, and you're like, that's unbelievable.
I know.
How
It's
does that
simplistic, but
happen?
it's
I don't quite
fascinating.
get it.
I know. It's crazy. They're such interesting. I mean, have you ever seen the videos where the hens will like gang up on the roosters? Those like viral videos of they all like fight.
I haven't, but I would love to. I'll have to go look them up now that we're all about chickens. Yeah.
I just really like chickens. Another thing the water connection. I'm kind of fascinated by your connection with water. I mean, you talk about some sort of body of water a lot, the way that water knows you. I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more on that, like what your
Um,
connection with water is.
yes. Well, I think water is certainly an image that reappears and appears. I think, a lot of that has to do with place and how place embeds in you and you embed in a place, right? And of course, Cape Cod, was swimming in kettle ponds and going into the sea, and then going onto the bayside and, canoeing across to get to the beach or going, so in that sense. But also in Connecticut with my grandfather, we were on a little river, a stream really. And again, that one, there was a pond where we swam that was, everything was about, for me, I loved being in water, And so that is just a sort of on the most obvious thing. It just, for me, is a happy place, right? But at the same time, when I come back to the ponds every summer, I stand on the edge of the pond before I take my first swim. And what I love is that uh, I feel like I felt like as a child. I mean, all the best feelings are right there. And so it's almost like a rebirth. I mean, when, talk about baptismal or something, it has so much in it. And I also love the idea that that it does carry our stories. And so whether it's a river that goes out to the sea, that where does it spring from? Or, an iceberg that carried, as they did, to the kettle ponds, right? That carry from goodness knows where, come all the way across what's now the Atlantic, and
Mhm.
get stuck and land and, create holes in the earth. And, it's really, that's to me is very magical as well. So,
Yeah.
um, and what's better than like looking out at the ocean when it's at its bluest and you're on a dune, right?
Mhm.
It used to be what was better was swimming straight out, and we can't do that anymore, as we know. But oh no,
Gosh. No, 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 don't do that.
no, no.
I just think it was so beautiful. I grew up with a mother who like she was like, let's go to the water. So I have a very similar feeling in this water. It's almost like a personification of it. Like it's like a friend.
Yeah,
It
it
is.
really is. It's so, and it's also the feeling, and when we were kids, we'd go under the water as, so many people do, and have what we called tea parties where we were trying to talk to each other and, underwater. Um, and it's funny because the very, very first poem in the book,
Mhm.
which is just that little stanza that I wrote that
Yes.
came from the Paper Palace, is to me in a weird way, the whole story of the book is in one line, which is, that I breathed underwater, I breathed in the water,
Yeah.
not breathed in, but I breathed in the water and survived.
Yeah.
And, that the meaning of that to me is kind of life, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of, as an 8-year-old.
As an 8-year-old, of course. Um, so this is like my interpretation of the Linden Stories poem and then What the Deep Water Knows. Like for me, it began as like you're dreaming of these other worlds, like in another world, chickens. In another world, my mom's singing me to sleep. And then in the end, you've kind of come to terms with like world is beautiful and this world is everything. And you've like come to terms with being on this earth in this life. And I just want, it's like, is that purposeful? And can you speak a little bit more about that? I found it so beautiful.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, that was purposeful in the sense that I always knew that if I were ever able to publish a book of poetry, that Linden Stories was going to be the first. And I don't know why, I just knew that.
Yeah.
My father, who's also a writer, who had read a bunch of we'd been sort of trading back and forth work a long time ago. This was at least 15 years ago, I'd say, or around there. And he is the reason that I really pursued trying to put this out there in the world, because he would just constantly say, you have to do this, you have to get it published, you have to publish Linden Stories. For, that was the thing that he loved. And I dedicated the book to him as well. And so I always sort of knew that where it started as an introduction was, hopeful, but also honest about, like, that sort of said, here's what's not working,
Yeah.
but here's what could be.
Mhm.
And so that it is sort of the set, to me, it sort of encapsulates as well the whole of it, right? The whole of the journey that this character or these narrators end up taking. and to a place of more independence, to a place of having, we were talking about mothers, having been a mother, still being a mother, but, you know, uh, the things we inherit from our mothers and fathers, of course, but the things that we inherit, good and bad,
Yeah.
and um, the things we then uh, maybe try not to continue with our children, and that sense of that there's a quote which is about my mother had a mother,
Mhm.
her mother had a mother, and we all inherit, right? We all inherit something.
Yeah.
They say, everyone is guilty
Mhm.
for everything, for your whatever. Everyone is guilty and no one's to blame.
Mhm.
I think that's also sort of learning that
Yeah.
by the end, where she's just standing with her mother and then they're having a martini and looking out, and it's sort of a sense of resolution.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I mean that as well, that journey came out in the compiling of it, not the writing. But the title poem, the last poem, the title poem, What the Deep Water Knows, was a much more recent poem.
Oh,
I
really?
think, I mean, in the history of it all, right? So so I think, yes, without, uh, yes, the answer is that there's a sense of, I wasn't writing it going, oh, this will be in a book.
Yeah.
It wasn't like that, but I was certainly writing from a different place and a
Yeah.
different kind of level of acceptance, but also level of gratitude, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
It's beautiful. I mean, and just like one other thing I noticed, I mean, I could go on for hours about I'm not a really big poetry person, but I found your book like was the first time I devoured it. I thought it was so beautiful, so compelling, like I loved it.
I loved that you say that, because that's something that's really, really central and core for me, is that I feel like, one critic said after reading it, who was really loved it, and she said, it's like you've written a novel in verse. And
Yeah.
I was like, novella, but yes. Uh, but, and it's not my story per se. It is, I hope, a kind of universal, that there's something for that, not just women, but I'm going to talk about women because, of course, that's, it's personal in the sense that all poetry is personal. And, I have said before that, nobody is writing a poem about a Russian spy, or, it's all personal, but it's not literal at all. You hope it's transcendent, and it's a way of making language that expresses your whatever that core feeling is. And that I really feel like people have gotten scared of poetry.
Yeah.
And I think that has a lot to do with poets themselves in a way. And I'm sure I'll get, lambasted for this one, but it's a very academic sort of, we are up here, and we don't, if you don't understand us, that's your fault almost. Um, and it doesn't have to be, and it can be complex and intense in all the same ways. But it's like, somebody being afraid of like Rachmaninoff, or, some sort of, or, but that's not better than Brahms.
Yep.
That's not better than, the lullaby, or, that's music that you can feel. And that's what poetry should be. I mean, it should be, I hope, transcend my feeling, or share, so that it actually has an effect on somebody. I mean, I'm not writing it for myself,
Yeah.
So
It's phenomenal. Truly amazing.
thank you so much. I mean, really, thank you for saying that, because that is the thing that matters to me absolutely the
Yeah.
most.
I mean, I was in the Capital One Cafe. I was like, my friends were, I was reading with my friends and I was like, ooh, and they were like, oh my God. I was like, sorry, sorry. Um, so I have a favorite poem, but I'm curious about what your favorite one is in the entire book.
Oh, wow. Um, hmm. Uh, well, tell me yours first. You
Um,
go first. I'm curious.
the one that I kind of not like this one just stuck out to me. It was Shadow Puppets. I think it's like a very heavy poem, but it's like such a universal experience in a way, like as a woman. And you just translated that so beautifully. And just like the way you described the man, I was like, oh, like gross. And it's just like such a universal feeling. And I really adored it.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that one was a hard one for me to actually write and kind of feel like to get to that you know, feeling of, there's one line in there about which really does come from a feeling I had, not that there weren't people in a garage looking,
Yeah.
it's not that, but um of that sort of self-inflicted scoliosis growing up in New York City. I would just walk with my shoulders forward. I didn't want to be looked at, and I didn't want, my budding bosom to be seen or called out. And I ended up with this terrible posture for the longest time because, you really do,
Yeah.
this, and it's so awful. It's
Yeah.
not, I mean, and it is a very common experience for all of us, right? So I'm glad that you love that one. My favorites. Oh, wow.
Loaded question. I know. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. I love I suppose I love some of the much more depressing ones.
That's okay.
No, I love things the tide has discarded because that feels very true to me. Um, Milk and Salt. I also, so I suppose The Art of Falling I loved. I love Borrowed Light. And there's
Yeah.
but also there's a poem in there that is completely different than the others, and it's one of my favorites, which is The Earth is Flat. And I think,
Yes.
that might be one of my very favorites. I don't think anybody else is, but for me, that was like getting to the end of that was actually cathartic. Going through what I had in fact gone through, in terms of my marriage and the falling part of my marriage. To me felt the most true to the experience of utter heartbreak and kind of wanting to give up, and then, you know, somebody just saying, you know, that's a whatever that horrible word, that phrase they sometimes use. It's a, what it's a, they say, sorry, a short-term solution to a long-term problem. Like just not pull it together, but to
Yeah.
find hope again. In that image, it just, I also had always loved, and it's funny because it kind of comes up again in what the deep water knows, is that, that idea that they say, in the early days of the earth, horses and deer, they lived in the sea.
Yeah.
Idea of, a deer running underwater, or, so that idea of evolution um, is a big idea in the whole collection, actually, a person's evolution. And then, of course, in the title poem as well. So,
Yeah. It's great. Um, yeah. I'm noticing now that you kind of begin also with a story of water, with the ship sinking, and then you end it like it'll carry my story. It's not nice.
uh,
That's great. I have no more questions. I just really enjoyed speaking with you. If you have anything to add that I didn't ask that you want to say.
um, no, I would first of all, I loved talking to you too. It's really, it's such a pleasure to speak with somebody who gets it, Um, I, no, I think really just what I was saying about the sharing of it. I think it's very scary. It's not like doing a novel in that sense too. Poems are like, snapshots of your soul.
Yeah.
But and it's been a very interesting journey from that point of view. So it is very rewarding to feel that it lands. And I think, it's in the honesty of some of the falling apart of a marriage uh, poems, which is obviously a large piece of the center of the story. Um, and also, a child going through some almost, dying, and
Yeah.
various the various most sort of scary and heartbreaking things you can go through. That it is as well a story of, survival, and strength, you know, finding your humor again and your voice. So, you know, I guess that's really the for me it's that. So
Yeah, that's great. That's so great. Okay, are you gonna, this might be a little preemptive. Are you gonna write more poetry? Are you gonna publish more poetry, I should say? I assume you'll write more poetry, but publish it, or do you have
I hope
anything?
so. I mean right now, I mean I hope so I'm certainly writing more.
Yes.
Um uh I hope so, but that's, we'll see how it goes. Um uh and then I've been, and I'm working on fiction as well. And so I'm slow because I'm very scattered in the way I approach my writing. I go through real phases of generating and then phases where I'm don't even sit down at a table, let alone like open my laptop, as it were. And then suddenly I'm back in that place. And in fact, where I write the best and the most is on Cape Cod, on Longnook, because there's a big old barn up there, and I can escape from everybody else and all the kids and the Michigas, whatever, and I can go up there and I just sit on the screen porch and talk about the power of place.
Yeah.